The parents lied about my father's illness to steal $15,000 from my wedding fund and pay for the Golden Son's honeymoon, so I didn't invite them to my wedding and cut all ties. I'm 26, and I recently got married. My husband, also 26, and I have been together for 6 years. We held a small ceremony on his aunt's farm, which was far from the beach wedding I had always dreamed of. The beach holds some of our happiest memories. My husband and I both love the water, and would visit the coast monthly to relax and recharge. I had even started looking into beachfront hotels for our guests. Like any bride, I wanted my wedding to be special, so I'd been saving for a grand celebration for 5 years. I work in advertising and earn a decent salary, but my husband and I have always lived modestly, saving for the future. Our plan was to book one of the best seaside hotels, so our guests could truly enjoy the event. It was meant to be a luxurious affair. But we had to change our plans and drastically cut expenses because a few months ago, my parents borrowed $15,000 from me. And I couldn't bring myself to say no. To give you some context, my younger brother, who is 24, also recently got married. His wedding was a last-minute, modest ceremony with only close family and a few friends. He had been dating his wife for about 2 years and proposed just a month before their wedding. It wasn't extravagant, but it was their choice, and I was happy for them. A few weeks after his wedding, my mom approached me, asking to borrow $15,000. She claimed my father had fallen seriously ill, likely due to his diabetes, and she couldn't handle the medical bills on her own. She said he needed an expensive medication that wasn't covered by insurance and had to be purchased abroad. Worried for my father's health, I agreed without asking too many questions. I visited him several times and asked Mom to show me medical records, but she always dodged my requests. Every time I came by, my dad would be lying in bed, but he didn't look particularly sick. When I asked why he wasn't hospitalized for professional care, Mom would insist it wasn't necessary, even though she claimed he needed this rare and costly medication. At first, I felt uneasy but didn't want to accuse my parents of lying without proof. It would have been awful to falsely accuse them if it turned out to be true. I noticed my brother hadn't been visiting our parents. When I asked why, Dad said they didn't want to bother him since he was young and focused on work. But they didn't seem to mind that I was stressed and worried. I called my brother after a couple of weeks, and he still hadn't visited them. He said he would drop by after returning from his honeymoon. This surprised me, as I had no idea he had gone on a trip. My parents hadn't mentioned it, and he and his wife hadn't posted anything on social media. When I asked why he hadn't told me, he explained that he wanted to surprise everyone with photos and stories after their month-long European adventure. He admitted he hadn't planned to tell me but answered my call because he was concerned after hearing about Dad's supposed condition. He said he contacted our parents, but they reassured him everything was fine and there was nothing to worry about. According to him, our parents had probably exaggerated the situation, and I, being a bit anxious, had believed them. I tried to give my parents the benefit of the doubt, convincing myself they might have hidden the truth from my brother, so as not to ruin his honeymoon or stress him out. Then my brother mentioned he'd feel terrible if Dad were seriously ill, especially since our parents had funded his expensive honeymoon. That set off alarm bells in my head. I asked him directly how much their trip cost, and he said at least $12,000 to $15,000. They weren't skimping on anything: luxury hotels, top-tier restaurants, shopping, and souvenirs. My parents had covered it all. That's when I realized where my $15,000 had gone. There was no illness. My father's sickness was entirely fabricated. They never had any documents to show me, and that's why my dad was never hospitalized. My parents made up the entire story because they wanted to use my money to pay for my brother's honeymoon. Hearing my brother proudly talk about how hard my parents worked to give him and his wife an amazing time was incredibly painful for me. He said they wanted to make sure they could enjoy themselves since they didn't have a lavish wedding. The money I lent my parents came from my wedding fund, which I had been saving for years. When I realized they had given it to my brother, I felt utterly betrayed. After my phone conversation with my brother, I confronted my parents. They admitted to fabricating the story because they knew I would never agree to give them the money if I knew it was for my brother's honeymoon. They claimed my brother had been struggling at work and feeling down, and they wanted to give him a chance to relax and enjoy himself without any worries. Unfortunately, they couldn't pay for his trip out of their own savings without jeopardizing their retirement fund, so they decided to borrow the money from me. Their reasoning? I was young, earning a good salary, and had plenty of years ahead to save that money again, unlike them. They also said, "It's just money," and promised to pay me back eventually. In their eyes, I should be thinking about my brother's feelings because this honeymoon supposedly saved him from depression and brought joy back into his life. I couldn't believe it. Their choice meant I had to plan a modest wedding for no real reason. To be clear, I wouldn't have minded cutting back on the wedding if it were truly necessary for my dad's health. But I did not agree to let my brother live it up on my money. I was furious when they confessed, and I told them they had to return the money before my wedding because I needed it to fulfill my dream of a beach wedding. There were so many expenses to cover if I wanted to make it happen. While my husband and his family contributed to some of the costs, I was still responsible for my share. My parents never planned to pay for my wedding. They made that clear years ago, saying they could either fund my college education or my wedding, but not both. I chose college and committed to saving for my own wedding, which I did for 5 years. For those wondering if my brother had to make the same choice when he went to college, he didn't. I asked him about it, and he laughed like it was the most absurd question in the world. I never brought this up with my parents back then because I depended on them and didn't have a job. Arguing about it would have only made things worse. But now, years later, the favoritism was undeniable. My parents tried to deny it, but the evidence was clear. I told them they had to return my money because I wasn't giving up my dream of a beach wedding just because my brother was supposedly struggling at work. If they wanted to pamper him with expensive trips, they could do it with their own money. I worked and saved for 5 years, not so they could just take it and hand it over to my brother. However, they said they couldn't pay me back immediately and would need a couple of years to return the full amount. They truly expected me to calmly accept this, saying, "There's nothing more important than family." They argued that if I was willing to spend the money on my dad's health, I should also be willing to spend it to save my brother from depression. But here's the thing, my brother was never at risk of falling into depression because of work. He never took his job seriously. He earned little because his income was commission-based, and he didn't put in the effort to succeed. If he was bad at sales, he only had himself to blame. Sure, he might have felt a little discouraged, but I was certain he didn't care enough to spiral into depression. My parents spoiled him from childhood, and he was never used to working hard for what he wanted. That's why he seemed down. It was all just an act. But my parents blew it out of proportion and turned it into a tragedy to justify their decision to save him at my expense. It was nonsense. I tried to explain to my parents how important this wedding was to me. I had already promised my husband and his family that I would cover certain expenses, and it would have been impossible without the money I had saved. But they insisted they couldn't return the money before the wedding and told me I'd either have to cut costs or ask for help from my husband and his family. Eventually, I resorted to begging them to return my own money, but all they did was shake their heads and say no. They promised to pay it back, but only after several years, not sooner. I left their house in tears. When I got home, I told my husband everything. He was furious, angrier and more upset than I was. He was ready to call a lawyer, but I stopped him. There was no point because we had no written proof that my mom had asked for the money specifically for medical reasons or that they had promised to pay it back. Everything had been informal. No agreements, no documents, nothing that could stand in court. Even if we sued my parents, it would only lead to additional legal expenses, and we probably wouldn't achieve anything without written evidence or correspondence. So, despite our strong desire for justice, we decided to drop the idea. It would have been a waste of time and money. Instead, we started thinking about how to adjust our wedding plans. Fortunately, my husband's family stepped in to help when they found out what my parents had done. His aunt offered to host the wedding on her farm for free. Initially, she hadn't suggested it since she knew we'd been dreaming of a beach wedding. But now that we were looking for alternatives, she brought up the idea, and I decided to check out the venue. My husband had been there before, but when I first set foot on the farm, I immediately knew it was the right place. It was stunningly beautiful, and even though it wasn't near the beach, we were okay with that. The fact that my husband's aunt allowed us to use the property free of charge made it even more appealing. So, we decided to move forward with the farm wedding and began planning from scratch. I threw myself into wedding preparations, and it gave me another reason to completely cut ties with my parents. By then, I had firmly decided that they wouldn't be invited to the wedding. As for my brother, I had doubts. After all, he technically didn't know that the money my parents gave him had come from me. However, he made the decision much easier for me when, after returning from his honeymoon, he called me to accuse me of humiliating our parents by demanding my money back. He said he had heard everything from our mom and was upset with how poorly I was behaving. In his opinion, it was a minor issue, even though he was the one who had spent my money. He assured me he'd pay it back when he could, but until then I should just shut up and deal with it. At that moment, I made my final decision. He wouldn't be invited either. After that, I stopped communicating with both him and my parents. Since I no longer had the full amount for my wedding fund, I couldn't afford the luxurious celebration I had initially planned. Honestly though, I think that turned out to be a blessing in disguise. The wedding we ended up having was far more beautiful than I ever imagined. We had to cut back on expenses, but it didn't matter. Over time, we realized that the day should be about us. In everyday life, we weren't the kind of people who tried to put on airs. Spending a fortune just to impress others now seemed absurd. We decided to downsize our wedding and do something more meaningful with the remaining money. In a way, I'm even grateful for how everything turned out. My wedding was still stunningly beautiful and magical, but without the excessive pomp and show I had initially envisioned. The people at our wedding were only those we truly love and who genuinely love us in return. I believe that's what matters most for any wedding celebration, and I'm completely satisfied with how everything turned out. A few days ago, I posted our wedding photos on social media. I had given clear and strict instructions to all the family members who were invited to keep quiet about the invitations, so my parents and brother wouldn't find out. If they had, they would have created a scene over not being invited. Thanks to these precautions, we were able to have a peaceful ceremony without them or any attempts to manipulate me into inviting them. But now that the wedding is over and everything went smoothly, I didn't see any harm in sharing the photos online. My parents saw them, and the next day they contacted me, demanding an explanation as to why they weren't invited. I was surprised they even expected an invitation. Our last conversation hadn't ended peacefully. On the day I left their house after our final argument, I was in tears, and we hadn't spoken since. The last time I spoke with my brother, he accused me of overreacting and made me feel as if everything was my fault. After that, I cut off all communication with him and my parents, and they never attempted to reach out. So, it was puzzling that they expected an invitation at all. Not only that, but they were genuinely outraged about being excluded. My parents called me, added my brother to the conversation, and all three of them started yelling at me over the phone. But by that point, I didn't care anymore. I found their behavior incredibly audacious and entitled. I had already removed them from my life, and wasn't going to tolerate their drama when I should have been enjoying my new married life. I told them that after they stole my money, I had to significantly cut back on wedding expenses. Therefore, I decided to invite only our closest family and friends. Since they didn't fall into either of those categories, they weren't on the guest list. After saying this, I hung up and blocked them, hoping they would finally leave me alone. However, about an hour later, my husband told me that my brother had reached out to him. He said that my parents were deeply offended by what I had said. According to my brother, my mom was absolutely devastated, crying so hard that she nearly fainted. That was all he said, but it left me feeling guilty. I didn't want to push my parents to such a state. Maybe he was bluffing, I don't know, but this strange feeling of guilt has stayed with me ever since. Am I a bad person for not inviting my parents to my wedding after they stole my wedding money? Now, let's take a moment to pause this video. Go ahead and answer the question in the comments below, and we'll move on to the update. Update 1. A week has passed since my last conversation with my parents and brother, and I've decided I will no longer communicate with them. My mom can cry as much as she wants, but it won't change the facts. On the day we fought about the money, I was the one who cried and even begged them to return it before the wedding, but they didn't care. They brushed it off so easily. Now, I'll treat them the same way they treated me. You reap what you sow. I also told my brother to never contact me or my husband again, especially my husband. He has absolutely nothing to do with this, and I won't let my family drag him into their petty schemes. After sending that message, I blocked my brother again. They've treated me poorly my entire life, but I'm no longer willing to tolerate it. Honestly, if I had the means, I would sue them and demand the return of my money. Right now, though, that doesn't seem likely since we don't have solid evidence. My husband thinks we should try anyway, and he's optimistic that we might succeed. He's already consulted with an experienced lawyer, and in a couple of days, we'll decide what to do next. In the meantime, I need to figure out how to get my parents to admit that they took my money under the pretense of my dad's illness, only to give it to my brother so he could enjoy his honeymoon. Proving this in court will be difficult, but I won't give up so easily. I want my money back, and I'll do whatever it takes to make that happen as soon as possible. Update 2. Yesterday, I told my brother to stop involving my husband in our family drama. Apparently, he took that as a sign to do the exact opposite and drag him in even deeper, despite the fact that this drama has absolutely nothing to do with him. After work, my husband told me that my parents and brother had bombarded him with messages, demanding that he talk to me and convince me to unblock them. When he blocked them, they took things to the next level. They showed up at his workplace. They waited outside the building, and as soon as they saw him driving away, they began tailing him, honking their horn non-stop. My husband had to pull over because he immediately recognized my brother's car and realized it was them. He also knew that if he didn't stop, they would just follow him home, which would have upset me even more. So, he decided to confront them on the spot. When he pulled over, my brother got out of the car, walked up to his window, and said they wanted to talk in person. There was a diner nearby, and my husband, wanting to end this ordeal as quickly as possible, agreed to sit down with them. Once they were seated, my family began their fiery speech. My brother argued that it wasn't fair for me to cut them out of my life over some money, and that I was clearly overreacting. According to him, the idea that I'd imply we were no longer family just because they borrowed money was taking things too far. They admitted they knew I had blocked them, and wouldn't respond to them directly, but they hoped that if my husband talked to me, I might listen to him. They tried to pressure him into reminding me that family is the most important thing, and that I should stop making a fuss over what they considered a minor misunderstanding. My parents chimed in, insisting they would pay me back, but couldn't do so immediately. They claimed they'd already explained this to me countless times, and said I needed to be more understanding because my brother was struggling at work and they were nearing retirement. They attempted to convince my husband that the situation was entirely my fault and that I was being unreasonable. But my husband handled the situation brilliantly. Instead of confronting them directly, he pretended to sympathize with them. He told them he would try to explain their perspective to me, but that it would be far more effective if they sent me a sincere, emotional message themselves. He pointed out that every time they had contacted me, it was in an accusatory tone. My husband suggested that if they admitted their mistakes and acknowledged what they had done, it might calm me down and make me more receptive. And the best part? They fell for it. My husband manipulated them into agreeing to send me a message where they would confess everything they'd done, genuinely believing this would make me back down and even apologize to them. Of course, this is complete nonsense. Once they send that message, we'll use it as written evidence of their guilt and file a lawsuit against them. I am beyond proud of my husband for how he handled this. He managed the situation far better than I ever could have. Honestly, I think he's an evil genius, but he's my evil genius, and I adore him for it. Update 3. My husband's plan worked, and we couldn't be happier. My parents and brother, like complete fools, sent me an email detailing every lie they told me and essentially confessing to everything they did. Now that we have solid evidence, my husband has given the green light to our lawyer to file a lawsuit. Very soon, we'll be getting our $15,000 back. $15,000 might not seem like a lot to some people, but to me, it means so much. I spent the last 5 years saving that money while planning for my future. I worked hard to achieve what I have now. It cost me many sleepless nights and personal sacrifices. I refuse to let all of that go to waste just because my brother is lazy and my parents keep enabling him. That's why we're suing them. No matter what it takes, we will get my money back. We've also started planning our honeymoon. We've decided on a short trip to the beach where our relationship began, a place that will always hold special meaning for us. Maybe in a few months, we'll plan a longer vacation, but for now, this feels perfect. We realized we don't need to impress anyone or spend a ton of money. We can simply do what makes us happy, and that's exactly what we're doing. And no, I'm not planning to act like my brother, who flooded social media with dozens of photos from his honeymoon, as if he wanted to show off to the world. Ironically, now he'll have to deal with a lawsuit. Do I feel bad for them? A little. But they brought this on themselves, and now they'll face the consequences. That's all for now. Be sure to share your thoughts about this story in the comments. Honestly, despite all the details I've shared, I still feel like suing my parents is an extreme step. I'm curious, if you were in my shoes and your family did something like this, would you take the same action? Let me know in the comments, because it's easy to say, "Of course I would," from the outside. But when it comes to your own parents, it's a completely different situation.